In a world ruled by men, one young girl's fate was sealed before she could even understand what destiny meant. England, 15th century. A kingdom torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war where brothers turned on brothers and loyalty changed hands like gold. Power was everything, and those who carried royal blood were weapons to be used, traded, or sacrificed. Among them was a child, Lady Margaret Beaufort, born into privilege, but never given a choice. She was small, pale, and fiercely intelligent. Deeply devout, they said. Even as a child, she prayed more than she played. But faith would not protect her from the fate that awaited. At 12 years old, her life was no longer her own. Powerful men saw her as the perfect vessel, a link to the royal bloodline of King Edward III through her great-grandfather, John of Gaunt. That blood made her valuable and dangerous, so they sold her future to strengthen alliances, to forge power. And before she turned 13, Lady Margaret Beaufort was married to a man nearly twice her age, Edmund Tudor. There was no romance, no tenderness, only duty. She was a child, forced to bear the weight of a dynasty not yet born. And within months of her marriage, she was pregnant, 13 years old, a child carrying England's future king. This is her story, a story of pain, power, and faith, of the girl who nearly died to bring a dynasty to life and changed England forever. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443 into a world already drenched in blood. England was tearing itself apart. The Wars of the Roses had just begun, a brutal struggle between two branches of the same royal family, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. And Margaret was born of Lancaster blood. Her family, the Beauforts, were no ordinary nobles. They were the children of passion, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Their love defied the church, the crown, and the laws of inheritance. Even when their children were later legitimized, the stain of bastardy never truly faded. To some, the Beauforts were symbols of romance and resilience. To others, they were living proof that sin could run in royal veins. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a proud yet troubled man. Disgraced after a failed military campaign in France, he fell into despair. And when Margaret was barely a year old, he was gone, some say by his own hand. That left her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, alone, a young widow in a world ruled by men. She was forced to play the dangerous game of alliances, where marriage was currency and daughters were bargaining chips. From her earliest days, little Margaret was told that her bloodline was her destiny and her curse. She was a Beaufort, a Lancaster, and perhaps, one day, a tool for power. In a kingdom where bloodlines meant power and purity was a lie, Margaret Beaufort's story was destined to begin not with love, but with sacrifice. In 1455, Margaret Beaufort was just 12 years old, a child in body, yet already a piece on England's royal chessboard. Her destiny was not hers to choose. She was given to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI, a man twice her age and twice her burden. To the Tudors, this marriage was a victory, a bond with Lancaster blood. To the court, it was politics, but to Margaret, it was a sentence disguised as honor. She was a child forced into a woman's world. While other girls learned to read poetry, she learned the language of obedience, how to smile when commanded, how to pray when frightened, and how to survive in silence. When civil war erupted once again, Edmund left her behind, a young bride, barely 13, left alone in a world burning with betrayal. He rode to battle with his banner high and never returned. Captured by Yorkist forces, Edmund Tudor died in captivity, his pride consumed by war, his body by plague. And Margaret, widowed before she had even grown, was left behind with nothing but his name and his child. She was 13, barely a woman, and yet inside her a future was already forming, one that could change England forever. Every whisper in court, every cautious glance from the clergy was fixed on her womb, because within it the fragile thread of Lancaster hope still lived. Narrator, low, reverent tone. That unborn child would one day wear the crown of England as King Henry VII. But before that crown would gleam, Margaret Beaufort would pay a price that no child and no woman should ever pay. It was the winter of 1457. Snow fell heavy on the battlements of Pembroke Castle, sealing the world in white silence. Inside those walls, a child, barely 13, was fighting for her life. Margaret Beaufort's labor began in the dead of night. The air was thick with fear and prayer. The midwives knew her body was too slight, her bones too narrow. This birth was not a blessing, it was a battle. Hours passed, then days blurred together. The screams of pain echoed through the stone halls, mixing with the storm outside. No doctor could help her. No prayer seemed enough. For a time they believed both mother and child were lost. And then, through the thunder and the tears, a cry, thin, fierce, defiant. A baby boy, Henry Tudor. Margaret was alive, but barely. She was so small, so fragile, that the birth had torn her body apart. The child she had brought into the world had nearly cost her her own life. She would never bear another child again. But in that fragile moment, between life and death, a strange kind of strength was born. She looked at her son, her only child, and knew that everything she was now belonged to him. Her youth, her health, her freedom, all given away in one long night. She had birthed a boy who one day would be king, but the price was her innocence, her girlhood, her peace. For the rest of her life, Margaret Beaufort would carry that night inside her, not as a memory, but as a scar. Because though she would go on to shape dynasties and crown kings, a part of her would forever remain in that cold, candlelit chamber, the child who died so that England's future could be born. England had become a battlefield. The Wars of the Roses raged without mercy, brother against brother, crown against crown. And in that chaos, one name began to echo in whispers: Henry Tudor. He was the last fragile hope of the House of Lancaster, and to the victorious Yorkists, that made him a living threat. Margaret knew it, and so, with a heart already broken once by loss, she made the hardest choice a mother could make. She sent her son away, across the sea, into exile in Brittany. he was just a boy. She, barely a woman. And yet she let him go, not knowing if she would ever see him again. For years, she lived with only his letters, sealed with wax, smuggled through couriers, carried in secret under cloaks. Each one a thread of hope binding her to a son she could not touch. But Margaret Beaufort was no longer the trembling girl of Pembroke Castle. The pain that had once broken her had now sharpened her. She learned to move through the corridors of power like smoke, unseen, but always present. She married again, not for love, but for survival. Each husband chosen with precision, men who could protect her, position her, or provide her with access to influence. To the world, she appeared devout and dutiful, but behind that saintly mask, she was weaving alliances, whispering rebellion, planting the seeds of a dynasty. Her faith became her armor, her prayers, her secret strategy. Every bead of her rosary carried a promise. Every kneel before the altar hid a plan. And every time she clasped her hands before God, she whispered the same plea, the same command to heaven itself. Let my son return. Let him be king. In the shadows of faith and fire, Margaret Beaufort was becoming something the world had never seen before. A woman who could outplay kings. By 1485, after decades of exile, prayer, and bloodshed, Margaret's prayers were finally answered. Her son, Henry Tudor, returned to England's shores. He came not as a boy, but as a man shaped by exile, a stranger to his homeland, but heir to its crown. Behind him, a modest army of loyal soldiers. Ahead of him, a kingdom weary of war, and a king despised for his cruelty. At Bosworth Field, the fate of England balanced on a blade's edge. On one side, Richard III, ruthless, hardened, the last of the Plantagenets. On the other, the ghost of Lancaster, the boy Margaret had once carried in her womb. The battle was fierce. Swords rang, arrows screamed, and the cries of dying men echoed through the valley. No one could tell which banner would stand when the smoke cleared. And then, destiny chose its side. Richard III was struck down, his crown torn from his head and cast into the mud. A muddy circlet of gold, trampled, broken, waiting for a new name. Henry Tudor was crowned on the field itself, King Henry VII, the first monarch of a new house. The Wars of the Roses were over. And in the shadows, far from the clash of swords, a mother wept. Margaret Beaufort, the woman who had suffered, plotted, prayed, had won the game that kings themselves had lost. She had outlived her enemies. She had outlasted her pain. The child who had nearly killed her in birth had now given her a legacy that would define England for centuries. From that day forward, she no longer signed her name as Lady Margaret Beaufort. Instead, her seal read, Margaret R. Margaret, by the grace of God, the King's mother. She had begun life as a pawn, used, silenced, and scarred. But she ended it as the matriarch of a dynasty and the silent architect of England's future. In her final years, Lady Margaret Beaufort turned from the chaos of kings to the quiet of faith. Her wars were over, not with swords, but with prayers. She devoted her fortune and her intellect to the pursuit of learning. At Cambridge, she founded Christ's College and St. John's College, gifts to the generations that would follow, monuments to a woman who had once been denied the freedom to choose her own fate. She wore plain gowns, ate little, and lived humbly, the image of a pious matriarch draped in devotion. Her days began with prayer and ended with silence. But beneath the surface of that saintly calm lay the memories of a life built on sacrifice. Every time her fingers touched her rosary, they traced not only the beads of faith, but the ghosts of everything she had endured. She remembered the terrified child bride in a cold stone hall, the girl who nearly died giving birth, the mother who watched her son sail into exile. Behind every whispered prayer was grief. Behind every act of devotion, the shadow of control, that elusive power she had spent her life chasing and finally mastered. Because Margaret Beaufort had learned the truth long before her time, that a woman need not wield a sword to change the fate of empires. She could do it with patience, with piety, and with silence sharp as steel. She built an empire out of pain, turned tragedy into legacy. And though history remembers her as saintly, perhaps what truly defined her was not faith alone, but the quiet, relentless hunger for control, the one thing she was never allowed as a girl. In June of 1509, Lady Margaret Beaufort drew her final breath. The woman who had survived war, childbirth, and exile, who had shaped the crown from the shadows, was gone. She was 66, and though her body was frail, her name had already become legend. Only days before, she had buried her son, King Henry VII, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world. Yet fate granted her one last vision of triumph. She lived long enough to see her grandson, Henry VIII, crowned King of England. The dynasty she had bled for had begun its reign. On her tomb in Westminster Abbey, her likeness lies in marble, serene, eternal, hands folded in prayer. Beneath her image, the inscription reads, "Margaret, mother of Henry VII, foundress of colleges and hospitals." A title of grace, of virtue, of legacy. But the truer inscription is written not in stone, but in history itself. It is the story of a 13-year-old girl who gave birth to a king, and in doing so, shaped the destiny of a nation. History remembers kings for the battles they won, and crowns for the blood they claimed. But behind every throne, there was always someone forgotten. A woman, a mother, a survivor. Margaret Beaufort was all three. A child forced into marriage, a girl who nearly died bringing life into the world, and a woman who rebuilt her pain into power, who forged a dynasty from the ashes of her own suffering. Her body was fragile, but her will was iron. She played the long game and won. This was the tragedy and the triumph of Lady Margaret Beaufort, the 13-year-old mother who changed the fate of England forever.